My name is Tami Navarro, and I'm the Associate Director of the Barnard Center for Research on Women. And one of the initiatives that I have the pleasure of running as part of that position is our Transnational Feminisms initiative. And through that work, I have had the good fortune to meet my three colleagues here that we're going to be hearing from today. And what I really think and hope you'll appreciate about this conversation is it really stays true to BCRW's core mission of having a conversation at the intersection of people doing activist work and people doing academic work. And why I chose these three colleagues for this conversation is because, one, they're fantastic, but two, they all have really varied experiences working in under-resourced communities, and really communities that have been, in many ways, under attack and have suffered real structural violence, things like extreme budget cuts over the past few years. And so I thought it would be illuminating to have a conversation with them. So you have their bios in front of you, and I'll just say very quickly, we'll start with Alison Swartz, who is pursuing a PhD in public health at the University of Cape Town. Then we have Charmaine Crawford, who is the head and lecturer at the Institute for Gender and Development Studies at Nita Barrow Unit, University of the West Indies in Barbados. And then finally, we have Deanna James, who's the executive director of the St. Croix Foundation. So we'll give them each, the structure of this will be somewhat different than the preceding session. I've asked them each to give us a brief 10-minute overview of their work, and perhaps more importantly, the environment in which they do that work. And then we will have a short structured conversation and then open it up to the audience.
Okay. Thank you very much, Tami and Barnard, for having me. It's all very exciting to be part of a conversation or a set of conversations today that include a range of different people, academics and people from civil society, and just the fact that this is open to the general public. I was just saying to Tami, that's amazing. I arrived here 2 days ago, so I'm still a little bit like, wow, with the jet lag. I did do all of the wrong things in New York, walking on the wrong side of the road and getting kind of aggressively pushed out of the way. But now that I'm here, and I'm going to let my feet touch the ground a little bit, I come from a background in anthropology and then completed a master's in public health. So my background's very much interdisciplinary. I've spent too many years at the University of Cape Town, which is in South Africa. I'm a born and bred Cape Townian, and that's part of why I say I've spent too many years in Cape Town, South Africa. I work in the new division of social and behavioral sciences, which for me is a very exciting and interdisciplinary academic space, which gives room more to social scientists working in public health. We teach students, Masters in Public Health students at UCT who are pursuing their Masters in Public Health degrees, and our division is responsible for teaching kind of introductory courses on public health and society, which is very much based in situating them in the history of public health in South Africa, and also in teaching qualitative research methods and qualitative data analysis. Social scientists haven't always had an enormous space in public health, so it's exciting that it's growing. Then we're engaged in, so I'm a lecturer in the School of Public Health, and I am also doing a PhD in public health. And many of our research projects and my PhD research is based in a space called Khayelitsha. Has anyone heard of Khayelitsha? Yeah, it's the second largest kind of township space in South Africa. South Africa is a very, very unequal country. I'm sure you are familiar with our apartheid history and the ways that the apartheid legacies have absolutely persisted and continue to shape the daily realities of people's lives, but very much spatial realities, access to healthcare. So I started working in Khayelitsha at the end of 2009, where I met, funnily enough, my boss, the head of the Division of Social and Behavioral Sciences, did a PhD at the University of Virginia, and then came to South Africa, and as a lot of anthropologists do, fell in love with a South African, a local person, moved to South Africa, and he formed all of these connections in Khayelitsha, who he then introduced me to. And it was in this space in Khayelitsha, through this particular pastor, that I began doing my research work there. It's also the space and community where Tami and a small bunch of visiting Barnard scholars came to see where I work. In general terms, Khayelitsha is a space of major contradiction, in the sense that it is one of the most kind of income poor areas in Cape Town. It's people live in abject poverty. I'm trying to do the conversion now between rands and dollars, which at the moment is a dismal conversion for us to be doing, because the rand has decreased in value so much. But people are living on very, very little money. The disparities between the public and the private healthcare systems too mean that people don't have adequate access to healthcare in the area, and so there's all of that kind of poverty on the one side, and on the other hand, Khayelitsha has been a space that's been very much the site of a series of very high-tech research interventions. Not only those run by UCT-affiliated people, although there are many, randomized control trials and such, but Khayelitsha was also one of the first antiretroviral pilot sites in the country. So here we are in this township space where people are living in a range of housing structures, some of which are made of brick, some of which are made of sheets of zinc, bits of wood, cardboard, don't have access to indoor toilets, don't have water inside their homes. Most people have electricity, and then there's all of this high-tech health intervention. So a lot of contradiction and complexity. The research that I myself have been engaged in this area and linked to this amazing man, Monwabisi Madkogi, who runs a small church and is an anti-apartheid and community activist in the area, began with community health workers, a group of people who a kind of cadre of workers who get called many things, who I've worked with for some years. And more recently, my PhD work is focused on how young people living in this context of extreme kind of poverty and social challenge navigate thinking about their health and well-being. How do they make a series of decisions, which are tough decisions? And I come at it as a researcher who is kind of doing a PhD in public health. It's an ethnographic study, though, so I'm very interdisciplinary, and a lot of the questions that I'm interested in grappling with is how do we push past kind of conventional public health thinking about, for example, multiple and concurrent partnerships as major drivers of HIV? How do we think about how relationships unfold, how people make choices beyond kind of thinking about them in narrow and public health terms? So I'm very excited to be part of a set of conversations that are about sustainabilities, and I think why Tami invited me here was as we were walking around this township space, we were talking about my relationships with the community and with these particular individuals in Khayelitsha, and I feel enormously privileged to have had access to a space which is very different from my living situation. And when we spoke on the phone about this panel, I was also saying it's something that something that I constantly have to grapple with in the context of my research relationships is my own position as a white, privileged South African person, and what it means for me, but also for our academic institutions, to often be researching, you know, across boundaries of difference, but down a kind of, you know, more poor, more vulnerable, more isolated, rather than doing research often, you know, with people who are of maybe the same race, class, have the same access to what we have access to. So I think very much about sustainability in the context of reciprocal research relationships and how to make them as mutually beneficial as possible, while still naming and navigating difference and privilege. Thank you.
Charmaine?
Yeah, thank you. I'd like to thank Tami and Tina certainly for the invitation. And I think that when people think of the Caribbean, especially Barbados, they think of the 3 S's, sun, sex, and sand. But unfortunately today, I won't be talking specifically about the sun, sex, or sand. But I think in terms of thinking through this conference on sustainability, the work that I do at the Institute for Gender and Development Studies at the University of West Indies in Barbados is really tied around sustainable development. And I think for us at the Institute, certainly we're looking at thinking of global and national economic trajectories within global capitalism and the legacy of slavery, colonialism, and so forth that has impacted with gender inequality, sexual inequality, in restricting the lives of women and other minority groups in the region. So very much so in terms of coming to this talk, I'm going to implicate the North-South divide in how Caribbean feminists are dealing with some of the things on the ground and being challenged with, and what the Institute is doing within a sort of institutional space that you certainly are restricted as a result of not only the bureaucracy, but some of the masculinist premises that go along with what gender equality is about, what feminism is about, and so forth. The Institute has been along for 22 years, and we're a dynamic unit comprising of teaching, research, and outreach in the areas of gender studies, feminist studies, masculinist studies, and sexuality studies. Certainly our mission and vision is really grounded in the progression of improving the lives of Caribbean women and men, but more importantly, dealing with both economic and gender inequality for the most vulnerable. One of the things that is important, and I'm glad Tami is here, is that our institute came out and was born out of a feminist movement in the region, and also linked to global feminist trajectories. And we have 3 units, one in Barbados, one in Trinidad, and also a unit in Jamaica. And it's around the activism and the commitment to feminism, not only in terms of the community, but in academia, that we survive and we understand ourselves. One of the things that was important is not just to have a split between community and activism, it's to show how your activism, your outreach informs what is done in the academy with teaching, knowledge production, and so forth. And in 1993, as a result of well-known Korean feminists coming to the fore, the Institute was born. This is just our unit here at the Nita Barrow unit. As you can see, it's sunny and warm and all that, you know, the warmth and everything like that. But I want to sort of articulate, and somebody pointed about continuity. It's a younger generation of women coming up to really come to the fore of some of the critical issues that are experiencing. And we have, in terms of the trailblazers in the Caribbean feminist movements, who are now in senior administrative positions, but the work continues. The triad of teaching, research, and outreach presents us as an anomaly within the institution. We are not just teaching as some faculties, or we're not just doing research as some institutes or centers. So we are sort of at times casted aside. What are you guys doing over there? When funding and resources has to be sort of negotiated, sometimes we're last on the list. So I think in terms of even sustainability, you have to have a tenacity to not only fight, but see your direction and also vision. So in terms of teaching, undergrad program, minor in Gender and Development Studies at the PhD level. We have research degrees, and we also have a community outreach training program called the Caribbean Institute in Gender and Development Studies. Research projects span looking at gender relations in the Caribbean. We also have a human rights and sexual equality project going on, looking at the rights of LGBT in Barbados and wider Caribbean. So we understand the link between gender inequality and sexual equality, and some of the discriminatory and overtly homophobic policies that the state has instituted against LGBT people. So that is what we're linked with. Also, we have a project that deals with sexual violence. Barbados is located in the Eastern Caribbean, and in the Eastern Caribbean, particularly in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, they have one of the highest rates of sexual violence in the world. So certainly we're looking into tapping into projects that address some of these issues. And our stakeholders are not just, some of them are the community groups, people we work with, but also we have to deal with aid agencies, UN agencies, development banks in the region who come to us to talk about projects and funding and so forth. A major part of our work is around the outreach. And I think our colleagues don't understand this. So the impact on public policy around domestic violence bills, sexual harassment, issues around gender parity in politics and so forth. So it's not just about us reacting, but also being proactive to some of the major issues that impact us. We also have public lectures that we do. And this is where Tami comes in. We have a training program that we host every 2 years, and it really takes at the crux, at the root of communities to get individuals who are working in their communities at the grassroots levels to come in and work on a project that is important to them. And we train them in terms of some of the skill set around gender analysis and development. And Tami certainly helped us this year in terms of facilitating a module. But the important thing is the collaboration and the alliances that is important. And I think you'll have to link that back to sustainability in order for you to maintain what you have and also to ensure that it's not fully depleted. You have to constantly be strategizing around alliances and what you can do. So I'm going to, in terms of, we're going to have more discussion. In the last little bit, as a result of the 2008 economic global crisis, certainly Barbados as a small island state was negatively impacted. Tourist-dependent economy, certainly we saw the fall in growth, unemployment, and so forth, and a really constrained element that was placed on civil society, and in particular women. And when you think of economic crisis, we have to think of when austerity programs or structural adjustment policies are in place, women sort of face the brunt of this in terms of buffering some of the social effects of government pullbacks in certain areas. And just to note that in the Caribbean, the income of a woman is very important to her family. In Barbados, over 47% of women head households. And it's not because, the stereotypical assumptions about female-headed households, they're living in abject poverty and so forth. You require a dual income to survive. So that female-headed household, there may or may not be a partner within that household. So this economic crisis has certainly been really disastrous to working women, and it also has been disastrous to our university and presently the programs we have at the IGDS. And maybe I'll stop there, and then I could tell you a little bit more about how the economic crisis and the austerity is affecting the Cavell campus, and also in relation to the Gender Studies Unit and what we have to do in order to sustain and also to survive.
Good afternoon. Tami, thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this. Tami and I go way, way back. I am from the St. Croix Foundation for Community Development. And I have to admit that when I was invited, I was incredibly intimidated to be in the midst of all these academics. I am not one. I'm here to talk about some of the important community development work I do as part of a community foundation. Just for a snapshot of the Virgin Islands, we are an American unincorporated territory, and so that means that we are American in every way except one, and that is that we cannot vote for the President of the United States. Which is an interesting position to be in. We fight in wars, we pay taxes, but we cannot vote for the president. And so in talking about the St. Croix Foundation, September of last year, we celebrated our 25th anniversary. And as we sat back and reflected on the work that we'd accomplished over the last 25 years, there were some really interesting observations that we'd made that we'd been working so hard that we'd never really stopped to think about how we were doing what we were doing and how effective what we were doing was. And two things have kind of punctuated and framed the work that we do. The first is at our inception, we were created immediately on the heels of Hurricane Hugo, which basically obliterated the U.S. Virgin Islands, particularly St. Croix. And so we were founded the very next year after Hurricane Hugo. And a decision was made. There were several decisions that were made when we were founded, I think have been really important to the successes that we've had. One is that we made a commitment to focus on community development, which is fairly broad focus for an organization of our nature. But we wanted to make sure that we embedded our mission and our vision in our name so that we would never lose focus. The second thing we did, we made the decision to function as an operating foundation and a community foundation, a hybrid organization, in an attempt to try to draw philanthropic support to the territory, while also building sustainable ways to support the work that we were doing. And so for those of you who don't know, community foundations basically, they build endowments, they develop funds, and they grant. They're grant makers for the most part. Operating foundations provide direct services, much more hands-on. And so we created this really interesting hybrid format that for us was really, really effective. And over the years, when we travel abroad and we sit with the Council and Foundation partners on the mainland, we're always interested that very few community foundations or organizations like ours look like us, operate like us. And it was for many years, we weren't very confident in the work we were doing, if we were doing it the right way, until very recently we reached out to the Council and Foundations and asked them for guidance on our format. Is this the most effective way to do this kind of work? And we were very interested to hear them say that never change what you're doing, that the industry is actually going through a massive shift because a lot of the work that philanthropic organizations do is very shallow. They have really great intentions, but they never get into the business of policy or advocacy, and so they leave that to the smaller organizations that they fund. And that there's this massive shift happening in philanthropy with all the billions and billions of dollars that they've amassed to really go deeper. And so she basically, the person that we spoke to at Council on Foundation said, you're about 10 years ahead of the pack, which was interesting to us because it's hard work. What we do is hard work, but you get to really understand the community you're working in. And I want to just share with you just some statistics on the Virgin Islands. For those of you who don't know, we have 3 S's. They were not the same 3 S's, sun, stand, and sea in the Virgin Islands. So we're similar but different in many ways. But
Sex tourism.
and that's where most people know of the Virgin Islands. They know us for our tourist product. But the reality is, the Virgin Islands is actually considered to be number 5 in terms of the most dangerous places in the world. We have a homicide rate that exceeds the national average. I'm sure most people didn't know that. We also have probably one of the most diverse populations. We have an immigrant population that exceeds the local population. And so about 40% of our population is foreign-born. We are, of course, the only English-speaking territory in the region, and so the Virgin Islands is, for many people seeking U.S. citizenship, American citizenship, the Virgin Islands is a gateway. And so that's another fact that I'm sure most people don't know about the U.S. Virgin Islands. We also have one of the highest incarceration rates. We have the highest incarceration rate in the Caribbean and probably the 3rd in the world per capita. And so I work in a very interesting environment. And of course, Hurricane Hugo, when we were formed, left a scar, an indelible scar in our territory. And we've worked really hard over the last 25 years to try to institute programs and support projects that we thought would have deep impact in transforming our society. We have not been as successful as we had liked to, but we were very surprised as we did our reflections over the last year of how much we were able to accomplish with very little. One of the other things that we did when we got started was we made the decision to focus first and foremost on infrastructure, which for us as a community organization, and you're talking about sustainability, was probably the most visible thing that we could have done to get attention and to build the kind of relationships and support that we needed from our local community who didn't understand philanthropic organizations. We were really one of the first philanthropic organizations to be created in the U.S. Virgin Islands. And the last thing we did was that we, as part of our operating format, we serve as a fiscal sponsor for smaller nonprofits and community-based grassroots initiatives. And so we have over the years been able to build, we have the largest wingspan in terms of the number of organizations and people that we touch through our partners, through our sponsored projects. And over the years, we've sponsored over 200 nonprofit initiatives. Grassroots initiatives are the ones on the ground doing the real gritty work. And so as we now look to the future, one of the things that's been made us very hopeful and optimistic is that after 25 years, we've established ourselves as a community leader. Our public sector looks to us for guidance, looks to us to build relationships. Our donor community has established, an incredible amount of faith in us with the funds that they've donated to the projects that we support and to our operations. And we work with more civic organizations that are doing more to transform our society than any other organization in the territory. And so as we now think about the next 25 years, we've really started talking about how do we challenge our national partners to pay attention to the Virgin Islands as a part of the American tapestry that is often overlooked. We are considered international by most national funders. We are considered outside of the region of others. And so we're in this really interesting space, and the challenge that we're presenting to national funders is to pay attention that we are isolated geographically, which makes social transformation and social change and the work that we're doing actually a richer environment to test best practices, to test really interesting and innovative approaches to transform societies, particularly that, recognizing that we have a community that's predominantly Black and brown. And so we're doing some of the most aggressive work we've ever done by looking at the industry, the philanthropic industry that we're a part of, and really challenging them to look at communities like ours to figure out how to best approach some of the difficult issues like violence and crime. I sat on a panel just 3 days ago on the school-to-prison pipeline, and just interesting conversation. Because there are differences between the challenges that are being faced, I'm sorry, I'm talking too long. The challenges that our communities are facing on the mainland versus the challenges we're facing. We are a predominantly Black community. Our police officers are Black. Our social justice system is, our justice systems are Black predominantly. And so there are different issues, but the interesting piece that we are adding to our conversation is the issue of cultural relevance, that we have a story to tell. We have a very distinctly unique aspect of our community that we think plays into how you transform societies. And so we are working really hard to draw attention to the U.S. Virgin Islands, to draw attention to the way in which we have formed our organization to support some of these critical issues like violence and social transformation. So I appreciate being included in this. I hope that my story is relevant to the conversation.
So thank you all so much for sort of setting the scene for us and giving us a sense of the work that you do. And so it's interesting to me that a number of you have talked about moments of crisis. So Charmaine, you talk about the 2008 financial crisis. Deanna, you referenced a bit earlier, in 1989, Hurricane Hugo that really gutted the island and the territory more broadly. And so I'm interested in this notion of moments of crisis. I initially had a time frame on it, so I was thinking in the past 5 to 10 years, thinking more explicitly about the financial crisis. But given this moment, right, of crisis, of a stark economic or political change or contraction, how have you seen that? I initially had the question as limit your work, but the previous session, for those of you that were here in Harlem talking about 1968 and the real violence that was taking place in Harlem as a moment of possibility, that all these foundations and organizations began, that were forged in the crucible of this kind of crisis. So I'd like to just ask you that. So given the sort of moment of contraction that you have all experienced in different ways in your work, what have you seen as the sort of limitations and possibilities that have come out of such crises?
Well, I'll take that first. So actually, 3 years ago, the largest employer in the territory, which is actually the third largest oil refinery in the Western Hemisphere, which was located on St. Croix, closed their doors. And so we experienced our second Hugo. About 3 years ago. We have depopulated approximately 20,000 people. Basically, our middle class evaporated in a space of a year. And we talked about, we had issues with crime prior to the closure of the refinery. It was magnified on a scale that I don't think anyone was really prepared for. One of the greatest pieces of this economic challenge for us is that it has, it sort of lifted the veil. You know, there were tourists coming, there was money still flowing in the territory, and so people were not really focused on the deeper issues, the root causes of some of the issues that we were facing. And the last 2 years have been probably the most exciting and interesting time of my work, because conversations have gotten deeper. People have gotten much more innovative in terms of their approach to really talking about sustainability. How do you institute programs and policies that will sustain us through these kinds of challenges that will come, from time to time? And so as an organization, we've kind of reframed our format, talking about public policy and how do we institute the kinds of policies that will allow organizations like ours to sort of help carry our community through these really challenging times. Our nonprofit communities were having some of the most interesting conversations about the role of nonprofits. They're doing probably some of the heaviest lifting they've ever done because of the needs of the community during this change that we're going through. And there are things that are happening that are turning our economy around. There are some of us that are not ready for it to turn around too quickly because we know that the kind of work that we need to do to really heal our community and create healthy communities, it takes a long time, and you've got to have the focus and the discipline to ensure that people are tackling it from the root causes of these issues. And so we are looking at public policy. We're looking at public safety from a very different vantage point, not looking, we had these conversations for many years about surveillance cameras and how do you support the police department. Now we're talking about workforce development. We're talking about career pathways for young people. We're talking about education reform in the deepest ways that we've ever talked about. And so the challenge that we face economically has actually been probably a real wonderful gift for us in that we're transforming how we work, how we nurture relationships with our partners and our public sector. Our public sector, I think for so many years people thought the government will fix it. And the government couldn't fix this. And so people are not as dependent on government for solutions anymore, which is probably going to be one of the things that will allow the Virgin Islands to be sustained through challenges, economic challenges like this in the future.
Maybe it's the academic in me trying to connect some of the elements. Thanks, Tami, for the question. I think for, at least at UWI, in terms of sustainability, the issue of crisis and sustainability, it's in four major areas: economic capacity, visibility, vulnerability, and for what we do, regionalism and feminist action. And for UWI, it's basically a government-funded university, right, since its inception. In fact, prior to the last few years, almost 65% of the income for the university has come from the government. And with the economic crisis, the government decreased its contribution to the university. Now it's operating probably with 59% or 56% in relation to income from the government. So that means the shortfall has to be made up from somewhere. So certainly the university and the campus has looked at private sponsorship, but they also have looked at tuition from students. And for your student, you understand, carrying a high sort of student debt. But since the post-independent period in Barbados in 1966, there's been free post-secondary education for Barbadian nationals. 2 years ago, the government abandoned that without having a comprehensive mechanism or plan to assist students in relation to getting their education. One of the elements of development for Barbados in the post-independent period is having an educated, skilled workforce in order to help in the progression of its society. And 2 years ago, that came under. That precipitated decrease in enrollment throughout the campus. If you were just paying an amenities fees of $500 and then you have to look for about $10,000 a year, where are you going to get that? That has had a significant impact on our program at the Institute in doing the minors, in a sense that we have had to really kind of think of new and novel ways to market our courses. We looked in terms of collaborating with some of our other colleagues in relation to the survival of our program. So in thinking through the economic crisis, For us, in terms of strategizing around it, it's now in relation to income generation, and I think we were talking about that. So not only for the university, but all for the institute. We're already outliers in the campus community in a sense of what is that gender thing you're doing, what is that women's thing, what is that feminist thing, and so forth. You're constantly fighting. With the economic situation, it's issue around relevance and how you can sustain that. The other element is capacity. We have a small staff complement. We teach, we do outreach, we have stakeholders in our constituency in terms of funders. And my concern certainly is with this added pressure for income generation and so forth, our staff capacity may not be able to survive that. And especially for the younger academics who are looking at their career path, you have this additional burden. I have the third point is visibility and vulnerability. The more visible you are in fighting for a cause and standing up for who you are, the more vulnerable you are to criticism, to backlash. And certainly in the mid-90s, there was a real backlash against the feminist movement in the Caribbean. So even in this crisis, as we promote our programs more, we utilize media and so forth, it's the heightened vulnerability that comes with that visibility. And one of the things is, and I'm just going to tie up, is how in the popular culture and the media, I know in US you're going through your own media blitz with the election, but in Barbados, with a population of only 250,000, the national paper and also the radio programs are the main sort of disseminator of information and so forth. And last couple years, there was a real sort of attack on one of the major women's organizations in Barbados, and the institute is implemented by one of the conservative men's group who just basically are talking about getting women back into their rightful place. When we talk about violence, they dismiss the disproportionate element of domestic violence against women and say men are beaten too. So we had this man who was going around the island with his one-man protest. Thank God it was just one man, but he had the sort of the support or the voice of the national papers and even some of the male ministers about how he feels that men are being wronged, in a sense that women talking about violence, that they should also talk about how women beat men too, that they should have, there should be a paternity test, mandatory paternity tests once a child is born, because women are swindling men out of their monies and so forth. So we deal with a constant kind of public backlash around some of the issues. And this was during the period of the time when one of the revisions to the Domestic Violence Act was being debated. It's eventually passed. Last 2 weeks or so it was passed. But this is the sort of stuff that we actually have to deal with alongside some of the elements in our area. But I think for us is our motto's here, we're here to stay, get over it. We have utilized, in response of the media attack on us, is using social media to our advantage, using television to our advantage in terms of public education and some of the things that are going on around gender equality, around LGBT rights. And I think sustainability is about risk, because even in talking about decriminalizing buggery or the same-sex elements of sex puts us at risk. But I think in terms of some of the things we've taken, or some of the things we've done to challenge some of the popular discourse, certainly is to use or utilize alliances where we could find the alliances, and then to have our counter discourse in the media and so forth.
Yeah, there are many crises that I feel like I could speak to coming here as a South African, and I think as I'm sure most of you would expect, the biggest one was the apartheid era and what that did to South Africa as a country and did to the nature of inequality and inability to access basic services. And education. It's interesting also hearing fellow panelists talk about how funding situations have changed and what the kind of structure of education is in the country. Tami had originally asked us to think about crises and context in the last 5 years, and one of the things that's busy happening in South Africa is a mass student mobilization around university fees, and the fact that students are paying too much for tertiary education. It's not by any stretch of the imagination as much as people pay here in the US, but it's too much. But so the first kind of crisis was in South Africa, and in the work that I do and see, and in the spaces that I live as a South African, is the apartheid era and the legacies that came before apartheid, historical legacies, the colony in South Africa, that mean that racial and class privilege and inequality really continue to shape people's lives enormously. Then coming at this from a public health perspective, so then we move to a moment where apartheid officially ends, in 1994, where we have our first democratic elections, and then we had the writing of our constitution, which is one of the most liberal constitutions in the world, which really is. I mean, our law around same-sex marriage is completely legal. We don't have discrimination on the basis of race or gender or religion. Belief. It truly is phenomenal, but there's a huge gap between what is written into law and what people's reality is. So coming at this conversation also from a public health perspective, the next major crisis to hit was HIV. We had in South Africa, it emerged in much the same way as in other countries in the kind of late 80s as a kind of concentrated HIV epidemic among particular populations. We then had a massive phase where people just died because partly of denialism. We had a president at the time, Thabo Mbeki, and a health minister, I'm seeing eye rolling from the audience, who basically, denied the link between HIV and AIDS and prevented public access to antiretrovirals to all of the people who needed it. And they've done a whole bunch of modeling and studies, and they estimate, and these estimates also vary enormously, but they estimate that essentially denialism led to 300,000 unnecessary South African deaths. So that was something that it was a terrible moment in South Africa. Since then, by the kind of mid-2000s, as I said, Khayelitsha was one of the first antiretroviral pilot sites. By the mid-2000s, ARVs were publicly accessible. There's a huge split in South Africa between public and private healthcare. And in fact, I mean, one of the more recent changes now that I also was going to speak about in the last 5 years is we have a new health minister, and one of the things that he's trying to do is bridge the gap between the public and private healthcare systems through something called national health insurance, which I might speak to in a moment. But the fact that we have such a huge HIV prevalence and related TB prevalence in spaces like Khayelitsha, which is a very high prevalence area. So the whole of South Africa's HIV prevalence is about 10.6%, but Khayelitsha, the space that I work, is about 30%. And this is in an area, in a bigger area called the Western Cape, which is the province where I live, which provincially only has a 3% prevalence, right? So there are lots of spaces where the prevalence is enormously low, this is enormously high, and HIV has fundamentally changed the kind of research interest in spaces where there is high prevalence like Kailicha. It's also enormously increased interest from people who are not South African. So South Africa as a country is on the map in a range of different ways. It is very, very much on the kind of health research map. And that's because we have the highest prevalence of HIV in the world. We also have one of the highest prevalences of drug-resistant tuberculosis in the world. We're also a country that's known for terrible crime and violence, which has made us a country that a lot of foreign people have wanted to do research in kind of HIV and HIV-related work. What's changed more recently, though, is that as the kind of we've had much more strength in our antiretroviral programming, HIV is becoming more of a chronic illness, which means that it's no longer the sexiest thing to fund, which means that all of the foreign monies that were sustaining a series of very, very important non-governmental organizations doing very important work no longer have access to that money anymore. And then there are questions of sustainability in that sense. What are they to do? It was also, I mean, to just one historical jump back, and then I'm going to hand over to Tami again. Before the end of apartheid, there were a series of really, really important progressive health NGOs doing work in primary health care, advocating for health for all, because the apartheid system was, of course, like completely skewed towards serving a minority white population and very limited and inadequate services to the black population. Then when apartheid officially ended, monies were then being channeled through the national government to all of these organizations, instead of them being able to access direct funding from perhaps foreign sources. This also really changed the nature of things, because it then meant that government got to decide which non-governmental organizations were and were not suitable or functioning in ways that they thought deserved to be funded, which was another major set of constraints for NGOs, particularly those working in areas like Kailicha, where there's enormous variety in the kinds of organizations that run. One of the biggest ones is a kind of treatment action campaign. They're enormous. They've done very, very important work advocating for HIV treatment in South Africa. They have a staff of about 50-odd people. They really are on the map. But a lot of work that gets done in Kailicha is basically, one woman running a soup kitchen, using her own funds, and just feeding, the children who live in her street and are hungry. So.
Thank you for that. You know what's interesting is that you all come and do work in such different backgrounds, but in this last set of questions, you all spoke to issues of funding or the financial realities of doing your work. And that's a question I had, particularly Charmaine and Deanna, you as well, thinking about the work of fundraising and financing the work in relationship to doing the work and doing the kind of radical feminist work that you want to be doing. There are things like fighting that one-man crusade that you talk about. But there's also things like grant writing, right? And things like fundraising that can take up a significant amount of time when you would perhaps rather be doing the teaching or the outreach or the research. So I just wanted you all to think about those financial realities in relation to the ability to do the work.
Thanks, Tami. That's a good question. I think that even for our biennial summer school program, this last round of funding, UN Women, United Nations Agency, and also the Caribbean Development Bank, where there are major funders. But in this round, as a result of the economic crisis, I had to do a lot of negotiating to get that in combined $100,000 US to fund this summer program, right? I had to, you wouldn't know this, some of the programming for the summer course, which we had different modules, I had to negotiate to see what sort of interests the funders might need to see presented on the program so that we could meet some of the criteria. So there's a great concern about our autonomy and our ability to really deliver this training program without giving too much. We understand we have to negotiate, and I found this round of negotiation really, really kind of challenging because I'm seeing the mode in the sense that things are tight. We need to ensure that we're getting sort of value for the money. Another thing in terms of an academic element, and I spoke to Tami about this because we are a teaching institute and a research institute, this is where the North-South divide comes in. The funding is really tied around development projects, not research. So as knowledge producers, there's a sort of an inequality in how you see the work we do at the Institute in terms of our publications, our international reach with other feminist scholars and so forth. Not to say that doing a project on HIV is important, not to say a project on building a road isn't important. There are basic needs and the so-called infrastructural development projects that are important, especially for women, water, disaster management, and so forth. But at another level, for our institute, we're challenged by not enough funding for research, the type of research of conceptual, theoretical, understanding of social transformation within society, and the type of research that will impact public policy. So we're really constrained about that, and you could look at the sort of the development discourse and how that is sort of an compass of what aid agencies and so forth are actually kind of banking on, measurable results versus a conceptualization or at least a prescription for making your society more equitable in terms of gender equality, sexual equality, and even in terms of racial and cultural equality.
So as a community foundation and operating foundation, one of the things that is particularly complicated for our organization is that we are a parent organization. We serve as an umbrella for, at any given time, 40 smaller nonprofits in a very small pool of resources. And one of the things our founders made a commitment to when we were created was that we would not compete for resources. It's an interesting challenge, and it forces us every single day to be really creative about how we sustain our organization while also sustaining the 50 other organizations that are doing really important work underneath us. And so the conversations we're having with the national funders and national philanthropic organizations is that the focus on supporting programs, which has been historically how funds have been doled out from some of the largest philanthropic organizations, has to shift to sustaining organizations, sustaining the work, sustaining the operations so that those organizations can continue to do the work. And organizations like the Ford Foundation are finally changing their approach to grant making to sustain some of those organizations like ours and like the ones that are operating underneath us to support operations in addition to programs to ensure that the work that's being done gets done and that there's greater focus on the work and not on development and fundraising, which has historically been an incredible distraction for us and for a lot of organizations.
Yeah. So in my university context, we operate in different faculties, and I'm part of the health sciences faculty, but I come from anthropology, so I know about being in the humanities faculty, and I'm sure is real for you all here as well. There is a hang of a lot more money in health sciences than there is in the humanities. And my sister actually just finished a PhD in history, and she jokes that she's now become increasingly less employable, which is true, because in some ways there isn't as much funding for things like history. And I feel very grateful for the fact that I now work in the Division of Social and Behavioral Sciences, where I get to do my ethnographic work in the context of a School of Public Health. But the funding reality is that almost the entire School of Public Health is soft funded, which means that we have to raise our own salaries in addition to raising all of our research money. And if we don't raise that money, then that's it. That's it. The good news part of this story, and of my story in particular, is what funds my salary is in fact an NIH grant. And there are lots of different NIH grants working through the School of Public Health at UCT. The one that I'm involved in is a collaboration between UCT and Brown University called the SASH program, the South African Social Sciences for HIV program. And actually something that's fantastic about NIH is that as much as there are a series of very, very careful and close regulations on how money gets spent and how money gets accounted for and the kinds of things that one has to get up to, there's also a huge amount of flexibility, which is wonderful and unusual too. Where there are all sorts of kind of stipulations about how one is supposed to conduct research or not. It's very lovely to work in an environment where we have more freedom.
Thank you. Unbelievably, it's time to open up for questions.
And I just wanted to, I guess, ask a question in regards to the title, because, you know, you guys are talking about working at the limits, the state and the structural violence, and a lot of what's coming across is sort of, well, the role of capitalism and imperialism, right? And, you know, Bob Avakian has a quote where he says, you know, what the U.S. spreads around the world is not democracy, but capitalism and imperialism and the political structures to enforce that. You know, and I think you guys are speaking to elements of it in regards to how it affects, and particularly half of humanity, right, the oppression of women. And there's a direct link and connection with all that, right? So then the question is, if that's the nature of the beast we're up against, wouldn't the solution be then to get rid of that system with an actual revolution? And so that's more what I would advocate for. But I'm just, you know, I just think they're real questions, right? What are the limitations of the system and the very nature of it, and can we do without it? Can we imagine a world without America? So that's what I wanted to ask.
It's a small question to start with.
So, you know, what's really interesting is that in the last 10 years, the foundation shifted our focus. We did a lot of work in community revitalization and infrastructure, and we've shifted our focus to education. We are, when I say we're challenging the system, we're challenging the system. We are part of a number of member organizations around education grant making. And we take a delegation of our stakeholders to a conference, Grant Makers for Education, every year. It's in an interesting, dynamic urban center in the US. And every single year, we walk out of every session more and more frustrated and angry. And we've developed some very interesting ideas about why our communities like ours are struggling when it comes to the American commitment to reform and how funding is dispersed in communities like ours. And so we are working really hard now to direct a lot more focus to international models of reform and international models of community development, because we believe that we're at that limit. We have maxed out our capacity to work within the framework that the American system forces us to work within. And so as a U.S. territory that sort of sits outside geographically of the continental U.S., we're using that as an opportunity to be really, really innovative and bold in our rethinking of social transformation, our rethinking of sustaining communities like ours through really tough times. So we're in a really, this is without question one of the most transformational times for us as an organization and us as a community. We're looking beyond the limits and the standards that have been set by the American system, and that's sometimes a controversial conversation to have as a territory, but we recognize that for our community to have a chance to really to transform itself, we've got to look bolder, we've got to look broader than we've looked in the past to how to make radical changes with constraints on funding, with constraints on just standards. You know, we have some of the lowest standards. When we look at our neighboring islands in the Caribbean that have a very different system of education, commitment to education than we do as an American. We talk about violence in the Caribbean. You know, it's just interesting that the one island or territory that is most affiliated with America has some of the most challenging demographics of any of our neighbors. And so we're having interesting conversations about bumping up against that limit and what we have to do to sort of carve a new pathway for reform for ourselves.
It's very provocative comment and question, but the reality is, in thinking through the fact that Barbados, when you think of the foreign reserves right now, majority of it is going towards debt servicing. You cannot kind of detach from how the unequal power relations, which in global capitalism is operating, defines what is going on in the region. They're certainly watching closely the president election debates and so forth in the US. What is interesting with this element of neoliberalism in Barbados right now, it's actually depleting the social welfare aspect of the society. So certainly it's a market economy, but the free education, some of the other things that is dealt with welfarism that sort of mimics some of the larger or certain post-industrial countries like Canada and some elements of Western Europe is actually being eroded. So Barbados is moving away from what you may say a little bit more of equitable distribution and an attempt to ensure that the poorest of the poor are provided for, towards a more sort of an equitable kind of economic system or policy system that will disadvantage working people, women, and so forth. And certainly, as a result of the legacy of colonialism and neocolonialism in the Americas, I don't like to be doom and gloom. You were set up in many ways. If you're a tourist-based economy or just one raw material and so forth, the competition isn't on an equal level. So this is an ongoing narrative, but the narrative has to be pulled back, and certainly for the younger generation, in a sense of how they can use the resources, the education they're getting, the skills, to have a new narrative about moving beyond tourism, beyond hospitality, and a sort of a servant-master type of economy, to one where you can sort of think about how you could diversify your economy, increase competition, and at the same time maintain some of the equitable distribution. But that's I think for Bajans, that has to be a real kind of, you're talking about a social movement and so forth. And unfortunately, Barbados is, in the last little while, there are unions, and the unions certainly put forth things, but in terms of the population themselves, they haven't been vocal enough to contest some of the neoliberal policies that are being in place.
Two very quick things. If you're starting a revolution, I'm behind you, is the first one. And the second one, I mean, I think you're talking about a huge set of issues. And just kind of very quickly and anecdotally, I work a lot in study abroad, a lot with undergraduate American students, a lot of whom are very interested in South Africa because it's a place with all these crises and HIV and poverty and animals and all of this sort of stuff. And this was not, I will say this also, this was not my experience of the students from Barnard, but a lot of the students who I interact with come to South Africa with all sorts of ideas about helping and volunteering and doing development and doing good. And I think that on the one hand, that's wonderful. And on the other hand, it's also not always possible in the ways that they imagine. So I spend a lot of time telling people that they can't, these undergrads who are going to spend a short amount of time in South Africa, that they can't, make huge revolutionary changes. We run a small ethnographic field school in this township in Kailita with a small number of students from the University of Virginia. And once we've convinced them that they can't help, they realize how valuable and important it is to just make the individual relationships that they build in the 5 weeks that they spend basically hanging out in this small neighborhood for 5 weeks. We stress the importance of building these interpersonal relationships and thinking about their own kind of privilege and difference and managing those on a kind of very microcosmic level before trying to tackle these huge questions.
So this is in response to your answer, really. And my question is, in this globalized capitalist world that we currently live in, do you really think that it's possible for countries in the global south who are traditionally have been forced into this position of servitude to really be able to get out through a capitalist system that is inherently like the countries in the global north keep them in the global south for, profit reasons?
That's a very good question. I think one of the things, and it hasn't been actualized, and I was talking to Deanna and also Tami about it, is a common market in the Caribbean in terms of a trade bloc. Certainly, you have NAFTA, the Europeans have it, and I think that at least in the English-speaking Caribbean, there has to be a concerted effort to see the value of a common economic bloc where goods and services, finances, and so forth are shared based on competitive value and so forth. And we have been talking about it. It's been talked about for decades and decades. But unfortunately, either islandism or other factors have prevented from happening. I think for Caribbean, at least for the English-speaking Caribbean, to sustain itself, especially Barbados, the three bigs, Barbados, Trinidad, and Jamaica, they have to think through, in order to compete in the Americas. We know certainly under Clinton, the whole thing with the bananas in terms of the WTO, in terms of the ruling, in terms of the preferential treatment through the British market, that really had a devastating effect on the Caribbean. So I think we have to, at least Caribbean leaders, have to really move beyond what they think is just a local issue around national interests and really embrace that regionalism around trading blocs, around strategic partnerships, and so forth. It's very difficult, and maybe because we're living through this economic crisis and we haven't seen how to get out of it at the present moment, the sort of the vision for the future where you say you're a little bit more autonomous and so forth is really constrained. Because if you're looking at the Barbadian government has, there's a freeze on foreign currency, so they're maintaining to ensure that they have the foreign currency to pay their debt. So even for me to travel to the U.S., I'm both a Canadian and a Trinidadian citizen. Even to travel to the U.S., there'll be limits on how much money I could actually take out of the country. So I think for them, it has to be a wider trading bloc, right? Especially to compete in the Americas between U.S., Canada, and Mexico.
Having to navigate this competitive space, but in a generative way. So I guess I was curious if you could speak a little bit about that. Like, how are you doing, or what have you found possible, or what are your ideas around generating competition, like between islands, between communities, but in such a way that it doesn't become destructive, but actually productive?
Yeah, so that's really good. One of the things that we've had difficulties about the mid-90s, there was this sociologist by Errol Miller, and he talked about the idea that boys were underperforming in schools as a result of co-educational primary school and secondary schools, and that with boys underperforming, girls were getting ahead, and therefore women were getting ahead, and we need to watch that because we don't want to create a system where patriarchy is actually toppled and so forth. That had a real negative impact on how education is viewed, at least in the English-speaking Caribbean. Presently at UWI, the gender ratio is about 65 to 70, 70 to 30 females to males. Young men are not, some of them do not see post-secondary education as a way of economic upward mobility compared to the past. And it may not just be in the Caribbean, but this skewed ratio has fueled that sensibility about male marginalization, and the feminists have arrived, and they have taken over, and look what they're doing to our societies, and so forth. And we've had to deal with some of that backlash. So you have this gender thing. What is this gender thing about? One of the things when I came on board as head was even trying to get more young men to take our courses. Probably they got sick of me after a while, or started to run the other way when I started to speak to them, but to see how gender is implicated and affect their lives. So that kind of narrative has certainly impacted at times. I talked about the visibility, vulnerability, in terms of some elements of us wanting to create particular alliances with groups, or even in terms of our faculty. We've had some colleagues of different faculties just saying, don't take that gender studies stuff, it's not important, and it's just about women and stuff like that. So we've had to deal with the ideological elements of how men and some women perceive what we do. And that's why I talk about sustainability around relevance, and how you have to continuously recreate yourself, negotiate and adapt in relation to that climate. So I think it has, some elements have gotten better in a sense that we have gotten an increased media presence on public broadcast television, where we're able to go on and talk about particular important issues, even though we might be challenging individuals. There is a public forum and discussion about some of the important things that are going on. Another thing that we are dealing with is, because sexuality is on the table, the homophobia, the heteronormative elements of the society is just infused with the sexism. So not only are we dealing with the so-called woman thing, we're dealing with that gay thing, and that import from the north. But we're steadfast in terms of what we do. We've always been part of the outliers, but we are certainly committed to, I just want to show you, if I could get it. This visual is from the Summer Institute. And this Summer Institute, I think we had the most openly LGBT individuals in the Summer Institute this year. But more importantly, we had young people who were vocal about the vision that they have for their society, right? There's a generational disconnect that is going on. So I think even with what we're facing, we understand that our critical mass certainly lies with young people who are thinking through new things, new ideas, and so forth. And this person, her t-shirt is love and respect, equal rights for all. And one of the things of her, in terms of her wearing it that day, was for some of her other classmates or participants who may not see the importance of the fight for gender equality and sexual equality, that she's committed to that, and through her organizing and so forth. So I think there is hope, and we certainly see the hope translated in the classroom, through our pedagogy, and as I said, our outreach inform, our activism inform our teaching and our research. And I think that's the way we have to go, because we would always have challenges. Yeah.
All right, so in the interest of time, we're going to have to leave it there. Please join me in thanking our presenters.